Greetings all, and welcome to lucasprues. In today's video, we're going to have a build of the 1/72nd scale Airfix D3A1 Val Japanese dive bomber. Now, this kit was originally tooled in 1965, and Airfix have re-released it. They've done it pretty much every 10 years, they'll re-release it, and in 2021 is when they last issued this as part of their Airfix Vintage Classics range. So it's a very old kit, and as you'll see, I'll be doing a few little modifications here and there to try and improve it. So I'll be releasing this in 3 videos. One video where we focus on the building, which is this one, and in the subsequent videos we'll look at painting and weathering. So without further ado, let's get into it. First of all, I gave all the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to help remove any oil and residue. This is technically footage of some other kits, but never mind that. And then I began to clean up some of the parts for assembly. I began by removing the excess sprue from both the fuselage halves and also removing some of the joints on the inside of the cockpit interior and the air intake, which was covered up by some plastic from Flash. The interior for this kit was disappointing, only being 2 seats, so I decided to design and 3D print my own Val cockpit in Blender as the program to design it, and then I used an Anycubic 4K printer to print it out in resin. I only made a basic cockpit with just a small seat for the gunner, a Lewis machine gun or the Japanese copy, with some spare ammunition, and also some instrument panels for the sidewalling and the front section of the cockpit, and finally a cockpit floor with the seats, some of the wiring, some of the oxygen tanks, and radio and navigation equipment. To my delight, my 3D cockpit fitted pretty much perfectly into the fuselage, and the only modifications I made was to remove the joining pins for the seats as I'd done previously, and to remove some of the excess plastic which would have been opened up for the cockpit in the real aircraft. At this stage, I also cut out and then assembled the wing halves and glued them to their respective fuselage halves so that I could make sure that the 3D cockpit would fit even with the wing roots in place. Overall, the fit of the wing halves was pretty good, although they didn't fit perfectly to the fuselage, but it was still decent enough. While waiting for the wings and the fuselage halves to dry together, I cut out and assembled some of the other sub-assemblies, including the landing gear and the engine. I did consider 3D printing a new engine and cowling, since the one included in this kit is very basic, but I decided instead to just work with what I had. The first major alteration I made was to use the side cutters to remove some of the excess plastic around the oil radiator, since based on my references, the air intake for the radiator consisted of 2 fins rather than a giant blob of plastic. I then assembled the wheels and the fairings that cover them. I found that there was quite a lot of excess flashing that had to be removed from both parts, and the fit for the fairings seemed to be overall not too great. The landing gear, or the tyre I should say, appeared to be a lot wider than the fairings were designed to take. Speaking of wider, I also had to use my Stanley knife to enlarge the hole for the propeller to spin through, since I found that the propeller was too wide for it. After some modifications, I eventually got the propeller in place and its washer, and then moved back to adding some of the finer details with the 3D cockpit. I used a cocktail stick to apply some Deluxe Materials Rocket CA odorless glue to the parts that I wanted to glue, and then put a little bit of pressure on them and held them until they dried. I added the details to the sidewall, such as the spare ammunition and the instruments, and then I glued some of the extra details to the cockpit floor. I had to raise the cockpit floor up a tiny bit from the bottom of the fuselage, so to do this I glued a couple of matchsticks in place to raise them up a bit. I later found it was easier to split the cockpit into 2 floor sections, so that it was a bit easier to help line the parts up. So after gluing the rear gunner's seat into position and doing a little test fit, I then set the cockpit parts aside to dry, and while waiting for the glue to dry on them, I glued the elevators into place. I decided it would also be easier to paint the cockpit floor and the sidewall details separately before they'd been glued together, so that's what I ended up doing. I painted around about 3 coats of Tamiya XF71 Imperial Japanese Navy cockpit green onto the sidewall details of the cockpit, and also on the 2 floor sections. I used a little bit of water to help thin down the acrylic paint so that it would bleed into some of the finer details and gaps, especially for the cockpit floor, and to keep the coats nice and light so that I'd end up with some nice thin layers of paint which didn't hide the details, rather than 2 or 1 thick sloppy coats that ended up hiding all the details. I then used a very fine brush to apply some Vallejo flat black for some of the details, such as the spare ammunition magazines on the fuselage sides, the instrument panels, the radio stacks, some of the various navigational equipment, the machine gun in the rear, and also the oxygen bottles. Once I'd applied a coat of black, I would then go along and neaten up any mistakes I made using some of the cockpit green and a fine brush. Some Tamiya medium blue was used for the artificial horizon, and some Tamiya flat earth was used for the handle on the machine gun and the throttles, and a little bit of flat white was dry brushed onto the instrument dials to highlight the details. I'd purposely printed them so that the instrument dials were raised from the instrument panel, which made it easier to add the details onto them and also on the radio stack. The other two colours that we used were a tiny bit of Vallejo Vermilion Red for some of the very fine details on the instrument panels and also on the oxygen bottles, and XF16 flat aluminium, which was used for the seats, as well as to do a little bit of metal chipping on the interior's floor and sidewalls. And with all the fine details completed, I could finally use a little bit of deluxe material Rocket CA glue to glue the cockpit floor into place. You might have noticed that while painting, the rear machine gunner's seat fell out of place, which I had to later glue before putting the floor into place. And at this point I also discovered that the machine gun did not quite fit with its mount to the fuselage halves because it was slightly too wide. So I ended up using some side cutters to remove the machine gun so that I could glue the fuselage halves together. The fuselage halves fitted pretty well. There wasn't too much of a gap, although it was still a little bit weird, especially on the bottom. I used a little bit of masking tape to hold the parts together while they dried. At this stage I also glued the front cowling into position, and after waiting for about 24 hours for the halves to dry, I could then finally remove the masking tape and add some of the finer details such as the arresting hook, the tail wheel, and the pilot's dive bombing sight. You might have noticed that I had to cut some of the arresting hook apart because I was supposed to have assembled that before putting the fuselage halves together, but unfortunately I forgot, so I had to make some modifications to get it to fit. Next, I used a little bit of Vallejo's water-based putty to fill in some of the seams where the fuselage halves were, especially on the underside, which as I mentioned was a little bit wonky, but overall the fit of the parts was still decent. I also glued into place the forward section of the cockpit, and then I applied a little bit of putty around the gaps where the cockpit and the fuselage met. I gave the putty about 24 hours to dry before then using various grits of sandpaper, gradually getting finer and finer until I had a nice smooth finish. In some of the thicker areas I also had to use a nail file to remove some of the excess. At this stage it was really starting to look like a D3A1 Val, but I was still very much bothered by the cowling, so I decided to use it as an opportunity to practice my scribing. I used some masking tape to create a thick border to rest the scribe on as I added some extra panel lines and also the individual cowl flaps at the rear of the cowling. Let me know what you guys think of my technique. I would definitely appreciate some pointers as this is something I'm only just starting to learn and practice. Overall, the results were decent, not perfect, but for a relatively inexperienced person I thought it was still okay, and it was definitely an improvement over nothing. I also had to use some polystyrene sheets to create the dive brakes because unfortunately I appear to have lost one during some stage of the build process. I do travel around a little bit, so this does happen, so in the end it was a bit of a blessing in disguise because I thought they looked a little bit better than the ones included in the kit. I also had to modify the brace that holds the bomb into position for the under rack because I found that it didn't quite fit without a little bit of modification, but once it had been done, it fitted quite nicely. I then glued the exhaust and antenna into place, and with that it was finally time to paint the aircraft, which I'll be doing in a future video. Thank you very much for having a watch of this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and a comment, and if you have any feedback, especially on my 3D cockpit and also scribing techniques, that would be great. I'd really appreciate that. It's always good to expand your knowledge and try new things, and I'm always trying to do that in this hobby, and it's great to have a nice community out there to chat about these things. So that's it for now, and until the next video, model on!